It just, in my experience, is sort of the way it works with studying Torah. There are these details in the text, and you've read through the text a million times. I mean, year after year after year, over and over and over again. But there is that one snippet of a verse that, for whatever reason, this particular time just happens to capture your attention. I think sometimes it's because of what's going on in the world, and so that event maybe draws your attention to something that you hadn't noticed before. Sometimes it's because of what's going on in your own life. Sometimes it's because of a comment in the commentaries on the verse that maybe you just never had the opportunity to study before. And sometimes it's a combination of all of those things that brings you to a particular point in the text. And that's how it was for me this week. In terms of the world, it wasn't the terrible, terrible fires that are burning in the LA area that made the verse in this morning's Torah portion jump out. And to move from that to something more mundane, it wasn't the Ravens' big game tonight either. I know a lot of people have purple ties on today, I noticed going through the congregation. But actually, it was a series of experiences that I've had personally just over the last couple of weeks, and most of them visiting members of the congregation and visiting them either in supported living environments or in the hospital or in memory care units, And it's the very first verse of the Torah portion that caught my attention, which is Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana. And it was that Jacob lived for 17 years in the land of Egypt. 17 years. Mallory talked about it a little bit. 17 years, the last 17 years of Jacob's life. It's a long time, 17 years. And it's easy to miss that period of time for Jacob extended for that long, because if you read from last week's Torah portion to this week's Torah portion, it seems like there's a quick narrative and the action moves along, that Jacob finds out Joseph is alive, he goes down to Egypt to reunite with Joseph, he sees Joseph, he meets Joseph's children, he blesses his children, the rest of the sons, Joseph's brothers, and then he dies. Those are the events that the Torah records. That's the narrative that the Torah lays out for us. And again, if you're not paying close attention, it seems that could all be happening in a very quick period of time, a matter of months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. But it certainly doesn't seem like 17 years have passed. And nevertheless, the Torah tells us, for 17 years, Jacob lived in Egypt. Now, we have almost no information about what happens to Jacob during those 17 years. Mallory correctly pointed out in her Devar Torah this morning that the classical commentaries imagine that period as a kind of golden age of Jacob's life. He enjoys family, he feels good, but in reality, the Torah tells us almost nothing about it. So what did he do during that time? Who did he see? How did he spend his time? Did he travel? Did he, go to work out at the gym of his local JCC? Did he take adult education classes like many of our seniors do? Did he go to shul, and maybe at shul he became part of the morning minyan there? Maybe he ran carpool for his grandchildren, as a lot of grandparents do in our community. He didn't need to move to Boca, because he was already living in a warm place. I mean, he was living in Egypt at the time already. What happened to Jacob during those 17 years? It's a long time. 17 years is a long time. It's a big, big chunk of your life. And there is a hint, it's just a little hint in one of the commentaries that might help us answer that question, what was happening to Jacob during that time. And it comes from the Radak. The Radak is David Kimchi, lived in France around the year 1200, was known largely as a grammarian, but wrote a lot of commentaries, particularly on the book of Genesis. And this comment by the Radak comes because of that number, that 17-year number that Mallory talked about earlier, the number of years that the Torah tells us Jacob lived in the land of Egypt. 17, it's kind of an unusual number in the Torah. Usually we would expect to see multiples of 7. 7's a magic number, so we would look to see 7, 14, 21. We might expect to see 40. Everything's 40, right? 40 days and nights, the flood up on the mountain, the years wandering, it's all 40. So why 17? Why 17 here? Does that 17 number ring a bell with anyone? Does it ring a bell with anyone? So push your mind back to the beginning of the Joseph cycle of stories. You have to go back to Parshat Vayeshev. It's 4 Parshayot ago, 4 Torah portions ago. And that's the portion that talks about the coat of many colors. It's a well-known story. It was made into the Broadway play, the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And we're told there, 4 portions ago, that Joseph, at the time, Joseph, Jacob's son, was how many years old? 17 years old. 17 years old. So we know that Joseph lived in his father Jacob's house until he was 17, and then he went off and kind of began his own personal journey. And that is what Rabbi, that medieval French commentator, picks up on. The 17 years there when Joseph is a child, teenager, and then the 17 years here where Jacob, his father, is living in the land of Egypt. And that parallel between those 2 numbers, and the Radak says this, says, just as Joseph lived in Jacob's care for 17 years, just as the son lived in the father's care for 17 years, so Jacob lived in Joseph's care for 17 years. So late in his life, the father lived in the care of the son for 17 years. I remember many, many years ago at this point, probably 15 years ago, sitting in the Gorn Chapel. It's Friday night service in the Gorn Chapel, and a friend of mine came to that service with her mother. And a number of days later, she called me on the phone, and she said that there was a point in the service, and my friend and her mother were having an exchange. They were just talking about something, and I don't know what was said exactly. Whatever it was, whatever happened in the moment of that exchange, when it ended, my friend told me that she knew that her mother was no longer taking care of her, but that she was now going to be responsible for taking care of her mother. And that idea that the last 17 years of Jacob's life, Joseph was taking care of him, that the son became the parent, if you will. The son was the caregiver, taking care of the father. That helps me to understand, especially in the context of the experiences I've had the last couple of weeks. It helps me to understand what was probably going on, at least in part, in Jacob's life during that 17-year time, the last 17 years. I wonder how it went for him. I wonder what struggles he had to wrestle with. What were the limitations he had to come to terms with? What were the challenges that he had to face in the course of that 17-year period? Because as many of you, by the way, many of you have said to me over the years, many, many times, it is tough getting old sometimes. It is a real challenge. Or as Betty Davis famously said, anyone know the quote? Old age is not for sissies, Stuart. That's right, old age is not for sissies. So here in my imagination, Jacob's last 17 years, I wonder if in the course of that time he began to feel the aches and pains in his body that he never had felt before. You know, getting out of bed, right, wasn't quite as easy as it used to be. Walking up or down, by the way, a staircase was challenging. Maybe he had a persistent ache in his left hip. Maybe he had a kind of dull, throbbing pain in his right knee that never seemed to go away. The joints in his knuckles hurt all the time, so it was hard for him to pick up a piece of paper or to hold onto a small object. The stiffness in his joints and the tightness in his muscles made it hard for him to do things that years before he wouldn't have thought twice about. Maybe he fell at one point. Maybe he broke his arm, broke his hip, hurt a shoulder. Maybe he needed a caregiver for a period of time to help him get dressed. I imagine also that Jacob, in the course of that 17 years, again, it's the last 17 years of his life, most likely had some cognitive issues to deal with during that stretch. There were many moments of clarity, I'm sure, but also moments where words didn't quite manage to get to his mouth the way he wanted them to. Maybe he forgot sometimes what day it was. Maybe sometimes he wasn't quite sure what year it was. Maybe he didn't know who the Pharaoh was. Those are the questions they ask you in the hospital. What year is it? What month is it? What day is it? Who's the president, right? There were moments when he was maybe a little bit confused, maybe didn't remember that he was in Egypt, that he had made that journey from the land of Israel to Egypt, didn't quite know where he was all the time. Things that had happened a long time ago, he remembers very well. We actually read the speech this morning. It's a beautiful speech, one of the most beautiful in the Torah. It's the end of his life. He's looking back. What does he remember? He remembers losing his beloved wife, Rachel. He remembers that. He remembers the first time God came to him to bless him and to guide him and to connect with him. He remembers those things from many, many years ago, but recent things were hard. They came into his mind and then they just sort of drifted away like wisps of smoke before he could hold onto them and incorporate them and pull them into his memory. And through that process, those things become part of his identity, but he couldn't do it anymore, at least the way he used to. And I imagine also in that last stretch of his life that dignity was a challenge too. Dignity. Jacob was slowly but surely feeling it pulled away. He once had been a powerful man. He was a patriarch. He was a leader. He was strong. He was in charge. He was in charge of his life. He was in charge of his family. He felt in many ways like he was in charge of his own destiny. But life has a way of just chipping away over time. His independence slowly was slipping away. Others were making decisions that he maybe had once made, even decisions about his own life. I don't know in ancient Egypt what the equivalent of taking the car keys away would have been, take the chariot keys away, or whatever it would be. But I do know from talking to many of you, many conversations I've had with you over the years, that when you take away the car keys from a beloved member of your family, it's one of the most painful moments that families have to struggle with. And I imagine that Jacob faced some kind of moment like that too. Now, the process of aging. It's easier for some and it's harder for others. There are a lucky few that cruise into their 90s with hardly a care in the world, no worries, no physical tsuris, and their minds are sharp. A lucky few, but I know from where I sit, that is relatively rare. The challenges of aging will confront each and every one of us. It's just a question of degree. And what we hope for as we go through that 17-year stretch, that metaphor of those 17 years, we hope for strength and courage to face those challenges when they arise. What we pray for is to keep hope in our hearts, even on the days that are hard, even on the days that are difficult, even on the days that are challenging. What we need the most, I think, loving family, caring friends who will be there for us and with us, even during the most difficult moments of the journey. If we are lucky also, in that stretch of our lives, we will have a community, like a shul, maybe, by the way, where we can come day in and day out and find there a sense of belonging, find their friendship, know we are cared for, know we are valued, where we find meaning, where we find fun, by the way, not to be underestimated, and also maybe, again, if we're lucky, if we're blessed, a sense of God's presence so that God also can be part of our journey. So I pray that we can be blessed with many years. We all hope for that, but also to be able to live them well, to live them with health, to live them with hope, that we should be surrounded always by family, always by friends, that we should find in our hearts faith to see another day and the possibility that it holds, and the strength and courage to seize that possibility, to embrace that day, and to live it well. As the psalmist wrote many, many years ago, the text of the Psalms, the 90th, teach us to use all of our days, God, that we may, in our lives, attain a heart of wisdom. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may that be God's will. And we say together, Amen.